Today on Soma Says, I'm joined by Karen Curry Parker. She's the founder of Quantum Human Design and a pioneer in energy psychology. She's here to help us decode our soul's blueprint and navigate midlife with clarity, purpose, and radical self-acceptance. Thank you so much for joining me today on my podcast.
I am on a mission to get people to look at the underlying narrative beneath disease so they can start a movement to begin an integrated approach to wellness.
Okay. All right. I know I did read a bit about you. I know you've worked as a nurse, a journalist, as well as a life coach. And then obviously we're going to talk about what drew you to this particular area. Have you been able to incorporate your previous experience with your previous career trajectories into this?
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
I feel like everything I do is still nursing. So much of nursing is education, wellness.
Yeah.
For sure.
What is quantum human design and how does it differ from traditional human design?
So traditional human design is a personality assessment system that is a synthesis of Eastern and Western astrology, the Chinese I Ching, the Hindu chakra system, Judaic Kabbalah, and quantum physics. Basically, using your birthday, birth time, and birthplace, you plug your information into a computer program and it spits out a chart. And that chart is really a map for how you use energy. It tells you a lot about how you experience the world. It tells you a lot about what I like to call your soul curriculum. Like, what are the core archetypal themes that over the course of your life you're going to be bumping up against, you're going to be grappling with as part of your growth and expansion. I studied with and worked for the founder of traditional human design in the early 2000s. One of the things he always said was that traditional human design, as it's taught now, is a prescription, and mostly it's a prescription to help people reconnect with what does right feel like inside my body and what does wrong feel like inside my body. Because most of us end up disconnecting. We start making decisions from our mind and we lose that connection. When he passed in 2011, he had not yet had the opportunity to complete the rest of that work and talk about how do we optimize the story beyond the healing path. And so in 2013, I began the process over the course of 3 years of really exploring and experimenting with all of the vocabulary in traditional human design and came up with a series of vocabulary words to use human design as an advanced storytelling tool, as a personal narrative tool or a narrative psychology tool, and as a tool to help people systematically tap into the story they're telling about who they are and how they are. And if that story isn't creating what they really want, including optimal well-being, where do they start approaching in a systematic way, how to rewrite that story? So human design and quantum human design are both really storytelling tools that help you rewrite your personal narrative.
Will they have the same reading or the same chart, I should say?
Technically, if they're like born to the second, they would have the exact same chart. And we get twins that have the same chart. And I think one of the things we have to remember is we're talking about humans. And the human story is a little bit more complex. And I might even add a little bit more mysterious. There are things I wish I could answer, like why are people different, even if they have the same design? But they are. And I think we all bring different things into our lives. We have different lived experiences. And of course, our brains are always interpreting. We can interpret the same situation differently. I have a brother. He was raised by the exact same two parents, but his interpretation of our family life and mine are quite different, even though we have very similar experiences, I think.
Yes. Yes, I think that applies to a lot of siblings, obviously, just people around the world, right? There are people that share the same beliefs and systems, but there are people that I know that have a completely different definition of how the earth spins, let's say. I see a lot of women in midlife, and I'm in midlife myself. And one of the things that's happened during my midlife is that I've started questioning a lot of things, like, is this right for me? Is this career path the correct one? Am I gaining what I sought out when I first became a physician, or why I decided to become a physician? So there are a lot of questions that have come up recently. Why do you think this would be such a powerful tool for women in midlife?
Oh, this is such a good question. And let me just tell you, I'm 60, so I'm a grandmother, which is like a whole nother.
Okay.
So one of the things that human design does, as I talked about in the beginning, is it brings you back into the body, or more importantly, it brings you back into a resonance with your authentic self. So if you think about it this way, when we're born with a signature frequency. And as we're raised, as we experience cultural conditioning, familial conditioning, societal conditioning, we are taught a formula for success. And that formula for success is not just success financially. I think when we look at this, particularly through the lens of being a woman, it's also success that says you got to be a good mother, a good wife, you gotta cook, and you gotta have the work. And now, of course, we've added in the last couple of decades, you've got to have the profitable job, you have to have all these things. And we're deeply conditioned to have to follow these rules. And what happens, I think, a lot of times for women is when we go through until that midlife point, which I think, interestingly enough, when we look at astrology, around 48, 49, 52, around the time when women start to go through menopause, beyond really actually go into menopause, there's a major astrological cycle called Chiron return, which is
Okay.
the point at which you encounter your core spiritual wound and you heal it. And in that healing process, you step more strongly into your purpose. And I think what happens for a lot of women is once we hit that mark, we're starting to explore the idea that, okay, I've done everything I should do. I followed the formula. And here I am at 50. And in a lot of cases, kids are starting to leave. Hopefully, if you're fortunate enough, there's a little bit of gap before your parents need to be taken care of. And you're in that space going, okay, I did everything I should do. And now I want to do what I want to do. And for a lot of us as women, we don't remember. We've gotten so dissonant and so far away from our signature frequency because we've done all these things to fulfill all these expectations.
Yeah.
We've gotten disconnected with ourselves. And certainly human design and quantum human design is a valuable tool to help us reconnect with. If I can throw away the script that says I have to be all things to all people at all times, and I can say, now it's my turn to do what I need to do, to stand in my authentic truth, to really explore beyond serving everyone, what is my purpose in the world, that human design becomes this really good tool to help us anchor back into that truth.
So your clients go onto the website, right? And on part of the website, there's a link that says, I think, something about human design chart. And you put in your information. I did it. And it's interesting. It says on mine, and one of the things that I've been struggling with on a personal level, and definitely professional level, is that I have been seeking more creativity in my life. This is something that I used to have as a child. There were many outlets that I had for creativity, but once I started medical school, really, a lot of it basically disappeared. And it took a lot of inner soul searching to figure out what is it that I'm really missing. It took a long time. And one of the things that comes up on my chart, it says inner authority creative, which I found very interesting. I don't know what that means.
So what that means is you are designed to use your inner passion and that connection to your feeling nature. When you encounter something where most of us are deeply entrained to go back up into that. I'm sure you were in medical school, right? And we figure things out, logic, reasoning, put things in linear order.
Yeah.
There's definitely a place for that. We need all of it. And for you, that might be part of how you process and make decisions, but your natural way of making decisions is to reconnect with that passionate nature and to not discount that need for things to feel right, other than just for them to make sense and to line up logically in your mind.
Does this line up with people who take those, I forget the name, the Briggs personality?
Briggs.
Yes.
I would say it's a complementary tool because I think, so here's how I would probably put it a little bit differently. And I think you can do this with human design, but I always say this is kind of the warning label I put on it.
Okay.
All of our systems are really powerful. They give us a strong vocabulary around this is who I am. And to a certain degree, they give us a label and a vocabulary to help us understand who we are. And a lot of times they give us permission to say, oh, finally, I know this is part of myself. What human design does that's a little bit different, and this is why I say it's complementary, it actually has built into the system decision-making strategies. It's really more of a how than a what. And so if you take, say, Myers-Briggs, and then you blend it with human design, it's going to show you how can you actually live more true to, say, those 4 letters that come from Myers-Briggs or whatever personality assessment you use.
Okay. All right. You often talk about each person having their own cosmic blueprint. So how does understanding our blueprint change how we make decisions, and especially during big life transitions like menopause, a divorce, career changes? How does that help?
So when you know yourself,
Yeah.
and let me just add, when we say knowing that cosmic blueprint, really what that means is that you have internalized the idea that you have a unique and vital and irreplaceable role to play in the construction of the world. And it's really true, right? The world is what it is because you're in it. If you're not in it, it's not the same world. It's a different world. And part of healing is healing our self-worth. Because when we lose connection with the idea of, I'm precious, I'm a once-in-a-lifetime cosmic event, I have a right place and right space to occupy in this entire cosmic story. When we lose connection with that, we lose our value, our sense of value. And we lose not only our sense of value, we oftentimes lose our direction. When we can reconnect with that and really recognize our preciousness, which is a word I really like to use with women, because I think as women, we forget our preciousness. When we can reconnect with that preciousness, we move from this place of really having to fight and proclaim things for ourselves and really move into what I might consider to be a stewardship of our lives. Quote unquote, selfish decisions, which are usually never selfish. They're actually what we need to do to restock ourselves so we can better do the things we're doing. We make those selfish decisions, or we start saying, okay, I'm going to take care of myself so that I can take better care of my family. We automatically, I think, with that decision also feel guilty. I always like to think of it through the lens of, if you're a mom and you've got kids, you're going to give those kids those vitamins every day, right? But how many times do we forget to take our own vitamins? When we move out of making it be about ourselves and trying to figure out what do I need to do, we start to say, take a perspective outside of ourselves, and we can step outside of our own story and say, oh, here's this precious story that I happen to be occupying at this moment. And it's such a precious story that there's no one else like me in this story on this entire planet, in this entire cosmos. I need to take care of this story. It's precious. I have to be a steward for it. And when we start to see our lives through the lens of stewardship rather than having to make decisions and cultivate personal will and making all those, guilt-based choices around me first that are culturally and even familially triggering in some cases, it gives us that distance to be able to see ourselves better, and I think, and ultimately to take better care of ourselves.
I think that's spot on, honestly.
Sure. I also want to really articulate this carefully because in the story that I want to share with you, the woman that I was working with actually made the decision to get divorced. I want to be really clear because I think sometimes we want to say things like human design made her leave her husband, and it wasn't human.
Yeah.
It was the fact that when we worked together and we really tapped into what do you need and what feels right for you, what is really aligned for you, when she was able to really reconnect with that piece, and she had a similar story to yours. She had a very high level career. She was not in medicine, but she was in finance. And when she really dialed into herself and really felt back into who am I, she remembered that creative place. It's very similar to you, and reconnected with these dreams of wanting to be a writer and wanting to write a novel, and was in a place financially where she actually could quit, make some big changes, really dedicate herself to going back to the learning process of how do we do that. But she had a lot of obligations and certainly a lot of places in her marriage where she felt very discounted, very taken for granted, and they had a very long 10 years of really difficulties navigating, creating a relationship in the way that she really wanted to be in relationship. And so over time, as she connected with, I'm a creative person, my creative essence, and really felt complete, she felt really complete with the cycle that the relationship was in. She found the ability to really tap into that inner courage to make that choice to leave that relationship. And she actually did go on to write a novel. I won't pass the name, but she actually did quite well with the novel.
Okay. All right. It's an interesting story, and one that I run into a lot with my own patients. And obviously, like everyone has a different story and obviously a different narrative. but this could definitely apply. It sounds like there was a misalignment with what maybe she was doing as her career. Perhaps it wasn't giving her the creativity that she wanted, and writing gave her that as well.
For sure.
What happens to the brain and our bodies when we're living out of alignment with our design? You've been talking a lot about people who are not aligned. What happens to us?
On a physiological level, there's a lot of impact with not being authentically aligned, if we want to call it that. We know, first of all, when we are not creating in a direction that we want to go, the brain gets disorganized. All the different aggregates of systems within the brain have a hard time aggregating and focusing. And so we feel scattered. We feel like we have lack of clarity. Sometimes we feel confused. We know that the stories we tell about who we are and how we are, particularly if those stories include a sense of being victimized or feeling victimized, a sense of powerlessness, or trigger any kind of what we might label as negative emotions like anger, then when we tell those stories, we can actually take people into the lab, and after they tell a story, and it is a limiting story, it actually causes IgA levels to drop, that our immune system goes down. And when we're chronically stuck in stories that are stories of disempowerment or victimhood, we actually make ourselves vulnerable to chronic disease and stress. We know that when we have an attitude that is optimistic, which I really believe, and I don't have research on this, something I'm looking at really researching, but I do really believe there's a relationship between being authentically aligned and optimism, because it gives us a different force and a different level of expectation of possibility. But we know that when we have an optimistic outlook, which means we're telling stories of hope and faith and possibility, that our telomeres are longer and healthier, we live longer, we have better relationships, we collaborate better, our stress levels are low, our heart coherence levels go up. There's so many positive impacts on the body when we take back control over the story, and we tell a story that is a story, again, of our preciousness, and one that invites us to drop the victim narrative and really step into the full expression of our empowered being.
If someone who's listening to this podcast logs in online to your website and does the chart for themselves, what are some small, meaningful ways that they can live in more alignment with their design without needing to understand the entire chart?
It's very easy. In the chart,
Yeah.
there are 5 different energy types. Each different energy type has a different way of making decisions.
Okay.
When you simply do that one little piece, and that's outlined in the report that comes with the chart. When you do that one simple piece, you don't even need to know anything else about your chart. You really don't. Because if we can reconnect with our natural way to make decisions, and if you think about this, where each and every one of us is right now is the sum total of every decision we've made. If we can reconnect back with our innate decision-making capacity and our capacity to make decisions for ourselves, then we start shifting the direction our lives go. You start being better able to set a boundary, to take care of yourself, to choose the things that felt right, but you didn't know how to choose them, or you didn't know how to dial into, oh, this feels right to me. You start to be able to feel your way into, this is my right path, and this is where I need to take myself next, through decisions, through making choice by choice.
When I was reading about you, there's a term that you use called identity wound. Is it when we are not aligned with our true identity? Is that what you're referring to? And then how do you help people shift towards it?
So again, I would just say, let's bring it back to you start making different decisions. So let's look at your chart. I know that you have creative authority. If you look at your chart, can you find your type on your chart?
It says alchemist.
Okay. So what that means for you is that you have a gut level intuitive response to life. And that gut level intuitive response actually makes sound, which sounds weird, but it makes sounds. And part of the beauty of it that it makes sounds is that it allows us to transcend all of our thinking, which when you're an intelligent woman like you, sometimes we have to bypass all the thinking, right? And get back down into that gut place. That intuition that lives inside of you makes sounds. It makes 2 sounds, uh-huh and uh-uh. And that when you start making those sounds, it actually turns on that intuition. And when you start making those sounds, it's like kind of the key that turns that motor back on, that intuitive motor back on. If you simply started going through your life and seeing what shows up in the world outside of you and saying, or I want to go this way, or that's not for me. Or somebody says, hey, do you want to eat chicken tonight? And you say, you start practicing using those sounds. You drop into this very intuitive way of choosing what's right for you and what's not. If you start progressively on a daily basis, making more and more choices that feel right, that are aligned for you, that are intuitive and instinctual, you'll actually start changing some of the directions for your own life. You start changing your experience with the world. And over time, it naturally brings you back to yourself. And you start to recognize that if you do this enough, it's going to start to get really difficult to choose against yourself. You can't go back to unchoosing yourself once you remember this visceral way of knowing for you. Now, the second thing for you is that you have to be, it has to feel right beyond just this intuitive piece. It has to have that passionate piece. You need to take your time to choose, that you can't choose in the moment, that you need a couple of days to really feel your way into your decisions and make sure that your decisions stay aligned and the same. Your choice stays aligned and the same over a span of a couple of days, because if you make decisions in the moment, because passion tends to be wave-like in the way it operates, it'll protect you from making a decision and then the next day waking up going, oh my God, what did I just do? You know that, don't you?
I do. I've had to learn as a more mature person to sleep on it.
Yes, exactly.
Even though I want to say yes right away or want to say no right away, I've learned to say, you know what? Let me think about it. Give me at least a day to think about it.
I might even say, yes, say think about it, because people understand that more. But really what you're saying is, I need a day to feel on it. I need to
Yes.
way through it.
How do you think menopause affects a woman's energy blueprint? You mentioned that somewhere between 48 and 50, and I don't recall the word that you used, there's something that affects us.
Chiron.
What is that?
It's a Chiron return.
Okay.
So if we look at this astrologically,
Yeah.
astrology is kind of interesting, because set up in the story of astrology is about every decade, there's a major astrological event in everybody's life that ends up being a maturing place. So we have Saturn return at the end of their 20s, Uranus opposition at the end of your 30s, at the end of your 40s, early 50s, you have a Chiron return, and then the end of your 50s, early 60s, you have a second Saturn return. When you go through your Chiron return, now, obviously this happens for all genders, but it's very powerful for women, because this extremely powerful astrological event is accompanied with this very powerful physiological event. Chiron is basically this energy that says, are you ready to live your purpose now? When we go through our Chiron return, all our life purpose, and most importantly, our spiritual purpose, comes up front into our focus. And we start to ask ourselves, what's going to be my legacy, right? What is, if we go back to the developmental work of Erik Erikson, right? What am I going to do with the rest of my life to make it meaningful? When we enter that Chiron return, that's really the question that's up front and center for us. And when we go through the Chiron return, it also means that before we can get to the answer, we have to heal, oftentimes, our core wound. Anytime we go through a growth cycle, we have what I like to call the same devil, right? And it's encoded in your chart. Your chart says these are the things that are going to challenge you. And they're going to challenge you again and again, particularly anytime you go through a growth cycle. New level, same devil, right? You go through this new growth cycle, you have to come up face to face with the same devil. Chiron is that same devil. It's that place where we carry oftentimes our deepest core wounds. And oftentimes when we experience those wounds, it gives us an opportunity to mature our way through this one. So I'm going to ask you, like, what year and month were you born? So I went, your core wound is potentially around the theme of control.
Okay.
Which means for you right now, there's a learning curve, right? Where you are being invited to look at what's within my control and what isn't. And if I'm going to take back control, what's mine to control? And how do I shift from control to self-regulation? But as you learn that, that moves you into your purpose. And part of your purpose, that same energy of control, is also the energy of sharing resources, in your case, sharing your story, sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, because you become the resource that then supports other people in discovering what is mine to control, what do I need to let go of, and how do I better self-regulate myself and take care of my value.
Yeah.
That's your big challenge. And I would suspect if we looked at your Saturn in your chart, which happens in 10 years from your Chiron return at the end of your 50s, early 60s, we'd probably see a similar theme. And really, I think what happens, and it's so profound, and most of my clients are women between 50 and 60, is it really is a big decade of awakening for women where they do step into this new realization of, oh, I have a different purpose maybe than what society has told me that it is. I think to a certain degree, we stop putting up with BS. We get radically honest around this age.
Right.
And our capacity to tolerate anything that isn't part of our purpose minimizes. And so we have this 10 years between 50 and 60 of really reclaiming ourselves, or maybe even, I don't even want to use the word reclaim because it's so different. It's more like we're staking our claim for an evolved, mature, wise expression of who we are. And it's a really powerful decade for women. And it's a decade we miss. We don't celebrate. We don't acknowledge. I think we're getting better at it. I think I'm seeing now in the cultural milieu more of a conversation about perimenopause and menopause. I think is great. I think certainly working with helping women through the process physiologically, but also working on the identity shift that happens, because so much change happens when we're no longer reproductive beings, right, in the way that society defines us. And now we are these entities that are capable of defining ourselves outside of the confines of all the different ways that we define women. And it's very powerful.
Yeah, no, totally is. I have conversations with patients who are in their midlives. They perhaps are perimenopausal, menopausal. As you were mentioning, a lot of them, their kids are about to launch or have launched. They find themselves then the chaos of raising children, of making sure they get to school and all the activities and all this, right? It just fills you up. And you're not necessarily asking those same questions, or perhaps you are, but it's buried deep down inside. And I often find that it's these same women who tend to have worse hot flashes, night sweats, all the classic symptoms, and the list goes on. But they tend to have more of that, which I find fascinating.
That's fascinating. And to me, that makes total sense, because I think we're cultivating this internal flame, right? And really in so many ways, and that flame can be passion, right? But it's also purifying. It's burning away the dross. If you think of it through the lens of alchemy, it's that place where we're letting go of not only old identity, because it's a new identity, but also all of those obligations that maybe we were handed without even having the choice of accepting. It just wasn't expected of us. Yeah.
One thing I've wondered, and perhaps you can, in your language, I am surrounded by caregivers, doctors, nurses, myself, obviously. I'm a caregiver to my mother. Are there certain profiles that are more prone to these kind of professions, or becoming or entering into these caregiver roles? And or are they also more prone to emotional burnout because of that?
So if we look at the chart, the place in the chart where the archetypes for nurturing and caregiving live certainly are associated with work sustainability, because we have to be sustainable as caregivers. They're also associated with guilt. They're also associated with overcommitting, also associated with codependency. And so there's oftentimes this very complex relationship in our stories when we are designed as caregivers. And I want to be clear, everybody is probably at some point in their life going to be some kind of a caregiver. If you have parents, you're probably going to be a caregiver. But there are some people that are just really driven to do it professionally, and in addition to doing it in your personal lives. When you have that energy, you're vulnerable to taking on responsibility for things that maybe are not yours to be responsible for. That's being the one that everybody relies on and depends on without even asking, right? They just hand it to you because they know you're going to do it. And oftentimes that caregiving energy is absolutely prone to burnout until you learn to set healthy boundaries and nurture yourself first as part of being sustainable as a caregiver. As caregivers, to live that energy in a healthy way, you have to take care of yourself, set good boundaries, stay sustainable, sustain your own foundation so that you have a better foundation to give. And oftentimes you have to learn to ask yourself what I think is probably one of the most important questions to ask yourself when you are a caregiver is, whose problem is it? because there's a tendency to take on other people's problems as your own. And because you are so good at taking care of them, that it's easier just to handle it yourself than to give them the freedom to fail and flop around if they need to as part of their own growth process.
And through the years, I've learned to definitely implement that professionally without neglecting my patients, obviously. And also on a personal level, because it happens to me on a personal level. I'm happy to help my friends and my family, that don't get me wrong. But then there comes a point where you overextend yourself. So it's interesting that it sounds like you've also helped coach people in that way as well.
I'm a nurse by training, a midwife by training.
Yes.
I get it. I have it in my chart too.
Yes. So understanding your chart, if someone is going through perimenopause and they take this test for the chart and they're speaking with you, how does it affect how they move through the hormonal changes and the emotional fluctuations that happen during perimenopause?
Sure. So again, it goes back to that very simple beginning place in human design, and that beginning place of connecting to yourself, to the body, and feeling your way into what do I need? What feels right for me? And giving yourself permission to follow that. Because oftentimes, let's talk about perimenopause. Some of the things that happen to us, we have the emotional swings, right? Hot flashes is classic, but I think sometimes we also don't talk about sleep deprivation and restless leg syndrome. Your whole foundation feels quite disrupted as you go through this process. And I think metaphorically, that's a very good metaphor for this season, both astrologically and also physically. You're going through this transformation and this shift in your identity. And having a map for how to reconnect with your identity and reconnect with, okay, what do I need right now? What does my body need? Do I need a nap? Do I need some water? What do I need right now? Is a really powerful thing. And oftentimes I think for women, it's a question that even if we think we've been asking ourselves that question, we maybe haven't been honest with the answer. And maybe the answer itself is shifting because, as I said, our identity is shifting. We need a new set of things. We need a new, different set of rules. And having your human design gives you, as I said in the very beginning, a very systematic approach to look at what feels right and what doesn't. And second to that, what's the story I'm telling myself about who I am, what I deserve, my lovability, my power? Is this story serving me? Or is it time for me to rewrite this narrative so I can step into a better, more evolved expression of my true identity?
All fascinating. I'm learning a lot. Honestly, I've heard you speak about it on YouTube, but I think it deserves a little time on this podcast. How did you incorporate quantum human design into your program? How did you discover it, and how did you realize this is how you wanted to work to help people going forward?
That is a long story because, as I said, I am 68. But I mean, honestly, I think in my first iteration of my career, I was a labor and delivery nurse for a very short period of time, and then went on to become a CNM. And I could tell with my clients, similar to you, I could almost predict who was going to end up being transported and having problems during delivery and who wasn't. And a lot of it had to do with story. I could tell from the story they were telling, oftentimes, as you said, the sense of control, like how much control they felt like they had to have and how much support they had, were often key predictor indicators of, are they going to be okay, or are they going to resist this whole process that they really have to learn to be in flow with? When I became a life coach, I started to see the same thing. Like I could see people's stories, and I could hear in the stories that they were telling where and how they were stuck. In fact, when I first started working as a life coach, one of the things I would have my clients do is I'd say, tell me how you eat dinner. Because the way in which you eat dinner, which is a time when we pause, we rest, we nourish, we take nourishment in, we connect. How you eat dinner, metaphorically, is pretty much going to tell me how you're doing your life right now. And if you don't have a dining room table and you're eating something from the microwave in front of the TV, it's going to tell me a lot about where you're at with your mindset, with your creativity, with your commitment to your own purpose and mission, and your self-worth. That idea that our stories are creating they're like memes, right? There's usually a core metaphor that every one of us has. It's duplicating in all the layers of our lives. that idea kept sitting with me when I was using human design and eventually using quantum human design, because I really wanted to look at what can I give clients to explode those limiting narratives, those base metaphors? Because if they could get underneath those base narratives and figure out where did that come from, and really look at how do I take back control over that narrative. And using quantum human design was so fun because it gave people a specific set of vocabulary words to choose from. So it got people out of the confusion of like, where in my story and what in my story, and gave them a very templated way to start exploring. Oh, this is a story I'm telling. This is my authentic self. This is how I experience the world. This is my purpose. And really began to give them the vocabulary to begin to be sovereign over their own narrative. It really shifted everything.
You discovered it and you used it on yourself, essentially. Yes?
I did use it on myself. I've used it on myself a lot now at this point in time, but certainly I will say for me personally, when I turned 40, I developed breast cancer.
Okay.
And at that point in time in my life, I was a full-time parent, full-time single parent. My first husband had left the scene, so I had no child support, no co-parenting. I had my own business because I wanted to be home at 3
Right.
in the afternoon. I had kids that needed to be driven and homework, and I believe in fixing home-cooked meals. And I really was struggling and had several years in a row where I only had 2 days off a year. It was Thanksgiving and Christmas. Because it was just a lot to manage. And certainly everything in my life at that point in time was about business and kids. So when I developed breast cancer, when I was done with my treatment, I was given tamoxifen, which, as you may know, one of the side effects of tamoxifen is depression. And
Right.
it was not like depression. It was like living in darkness. And I have never had that experience in my life before. And at a certain point, I just thought, I can't live like this. I'd rather die. This is so dark. And again, this is my story. And I always really want to be cautious when I share this story, because obviously if you're taking tamoxifen or whatever, make those
Right.
decisions with good
Right.
medical support. I did go to my physician. They did not support my decision, but I just knew that this was not working for me. And I decided to take myself off the tamoxifen and decided that I needed to have a serious conversation with my body, because it really felt like there was a message that I was missing that my body was giving me and I was not paying attention. And so I really went into deep dialogue with my body and I said, what is going on? And my body shared with me, breasts are nurturing. It's all about nurturing energy. And I was giving to everybody else, and there was nothing for me. Nothing. I had no friends. People were like, are you dating? Like, how the heck would I have ever been able to date? Everything was in survival mode. And so I had to start this radical cycle of rewiring myself to allow myself to support myself. And it was a radical shift because I had never seen, as a woman, being raised by a traditional mother, a traditional grandmother, I had never seen what does it look like as a mother to take care of yourself. And certainly they always had husbands. I was also like, how do I do this and also be like the only person running the show? And it took a few years, but it definitely completely shifted my energy. It completely shifted my relationship with my kids, my relationship with my work. And I'm certainly, here I am 25 years later. Is that right? That's right. 25 years later, almost 25 years later. It went by fast. Still cancer-free and really quite joyful in my self-care at this point. Radical in my enjoyment of my self-care.
You had to talk about a part of your chart, right, that surprised you the most and helped you to maybe change. What would that be?
I think for me, very similar to your chart, I had to get back into my gut because I was definitely making decisions with a very active mind and leaping from thing to thing and quitting very quickly if things got frustrating. And when I learned to shift that dial and drop back into, okay, what feels right? It allowed me to stay the course when things got frustrating and not quit. It allowed me to better discern what are the things I should be doing, what are the things I shouldn't be doing. It certainly allowed me to honestly move into a deeper level of trust in the world, because I discovered through following my gut, my sacral is what we call it in human design. By following that, I started to see that there really was a lot of support in the way my path was unfolding if I was following my true path. And it wasn't always like the whole thing didn't unfold in one drop, but I really was clearly shown, and still to this day, I feel like I'm clearly shown every day, this is the next right step and the next right step. And practicing that and doing that repeatedly and learning to really trust my own intuition and my own intuitive response to what's right for me, I think has really allowed me to stay out of stress to a certain degree, because I don't really stress about decisions. I get impatient sometimes. I don't stress about, am I going to be okay? And what am I going to do? I don't figure things out anymore in the same way, which is actually really fun because I'm a curious person. That leaves a whole lot more bandwidth in my head to explore things and read things and not feel like, oh, now I have to turn this into something. I can just play in the world and be curious.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of what you're saying really resonates for me on a professional level. It was COVID that basically put a halt to everything. I used it as an excuse to say, you know what? Nothing is happening. We're in COVID, especially for 2020 and most of 2021. And I personally feel I use it as an excuse to live in that stagnant kind of place. I now look back at that and say, you know what? When those same feelings come up, I have to pay more attention to it. I think it sounds like if I had recognized or maybe identified these things in my chart, maybe I wouldn't have to go through that process. Do you find that people often stress less or have less moments of uncertainty working with you?
I would say stress less is a good way of putting it, but I don't know.
Okay.
Part of what happens is you start to be able to reframe your life through the lens of the hero's journey. And when you can see your life as a story, and that, again, taking that bigger step back, you start to see those points in time where, say, COVID or whatever might happen. You start to see those things as the culmination of the sacred flaw in the story. It's just a challenge. It's a failure. It's not the end of the story. It's just the cliffhanger in the story, but there's a redemption arc. And when we start to recognize that, when we hit those spaces, because I could never guarantee that you might never feel that way again, nothing bad will ever happen. I think sometimes people think, live your design, click your heels together 3 times, poof, everything's going to be magic all the time. Life happens and we go through those disruptive cycles oftentimes because we've outgrown our old story and our higher self is saying, hey, you're getting bored, you're getting complacent, time to shake things up a little bit.
Yeah.
If you ever did hit that space again, you would think about it from a very different lens and you would recognize, oh, this is a cataclysmic point for me. This is the time for me to really call in. What do I need to catalyze here? And how can I use this energy, first of all, as a message? Obviously, my life is giving me a message. And what do I need to shift and change to grow beyond this message?
Yeah. Part of what you're saying was what led to this very podcast itself. I think it's been a year and a half that I've had this podcast, and it's given me a great way of meeting people that I otherwise would never have met. And not just doctors and other medical professionals, but people who help other people in ways that I would never have imagined. If you had to talk about a few things that are misunderstood about quantum human design, what would those be?
I would say one of the things that was probably the easiest way to say it, it's not a labeling system. People want to take their chart, say, oh, I'm a this and I'm a that, and stick the label on and be like, okay, I got the uncertainty covered.
Yes.
And I'm not a fan of labeling because we're not static, we're dynamic. It is basically a box of archetypes that you are designed to play with as part of your growth process. And it helps you refine your understanding of that growth process so that you can really be sovereign over that evolution. And when people start to throw labels on, it drives me nuts. So.
Of course. I've learned a lot from you. Thank you so much for joining me. If my listeners were to look for your website, look for your social media handles, where would they go?
Website is quantumhumandesign.com. And you can find me on social media. It's Dr. Karen Parker 22. And that's on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube.
I'll be sure to include all of that in the show notes. We've covered a lot. Is there anything we haven't discussed that you wanted to include?
I would just say we are stories. And if we can individually take back control over our stories, and most importantly, in conjunction with that, heal our will centers, self-worth, it's probably the most revolutionary thing I think we can do on the planet right now. We know from research that well-being is contagious. If you live next door to somebody who's happy, even if you don't ever encounter that person, your chances of being happy go up by 60%. We know that when people are living in a state of well-being, cooperation goes up, collaboration goes up, conflict goes down, our performance goes up. When we live in a community that identifies as a community of well-being, the communities around it, we can take care of ourselves and define for ourselves who we are and become revolutionaries in shifting that base of well-being. And I think when we are living in a state of well-being, we make an entirely set of different decisions. As I said, I'm a grandmother. I look at my grandbabies and I think this world has to change. We have to change it. We need to grow and change and never make a decision against a child again in any way, shape, or form.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. This was great. I love talking to you.
Thank you. Me too.